Hello and welcome back to another vlog. Today, to close out the year, I thought it would be fun to rank every single book that I read this year. I read 65 books, which I'm pretty sure is more than I've read in a year since I was like a teenager and all I did was read. I really jumped back into reading full force this year. I had so much fun with it. Genuinely, there are only 3 books on this entire list that I didn't like. So it's pretty good. I had a few others that aren't on this list that I didn't finish. I'm only including books that I finished on this list. I am rating all of them on a 5-star scale and ranking them from worst to best. This is gonna be part 1, starting with the worst and working our way up. And then tomorrow I'm gonna be posting part 2, which will be the best books of the year, the top half. I'm not gonna give any spoilers, but I will give like a vague-ish plot description, enough to like explain my rating and give a little bit of a preview so that if it sounds like an interesting book, you can add it to your reading list for this upcoming year. Which, by the way, let me know down in the comments what your top books of 2024 were, because you guys always have the best recommendations and I want to do just as much reading in 2025. So, also I will say my taste in books is really all over the board. I like nonfiction, I like fiction, I like romance, I like historical books. There's a little of everything on this list, and also my ratings are entirely subjective. Without further ado, let's get into it. Starting with the worst book of the whole year, maybe the worst book I've ever read, we have 50 Shades Darker, 1 star. This is the sequel to 50 Shades of Grey, and I never read that book when like all the hype was around it of like it being so spicy and raunchy and a page turner in the movie. Like I just never read it. So actually last year I read that one and it was fine. Like I just kind of wanted to see what the hype was about and it was okay. But this book, the sequel, was atrocious. The sex scenes were beyond repetitive. The storyline was repetitive. The characters were so unbelievable. Truly such a hard book to get through. Like the writing was just not for me, and I pretty much only trudged through this book so that I could have the satisfaction of giving it 1 star. Then we have Distant Shores by Kristin Hannah. Kristin Hannah occupies a lot of the top spots on this list, but this book was just not it for me. I give it 2 stars. It's about a couple whose marriage is kind of like on the precipice of falling apart, and we follow the woman's journey of finding herself again. I just felt like this was kind of a letdown from Hannah's other work. The characters were pretty frustrating and I was actively rooting for their marriage to fail. I did not think that they should be together, and there just wasn't really much in this book that was redeeming for me. Moving up to 2.5 stars, we have Bride by Ali Hazelwood. This is a very like hyped up book on social media, and granted it is not like my usual thing. So it's I think less about this is a bad book and more about like it's just not for me. It's a vampire werewolf romance. I tried to go into it with an open mind. I'm like, let me expand my horizons a little bit. Kenzie and I were reading it together. But the relationship at the core of this book just kind of made me cringe, and none of the characters felt very genuine to me. The world didn't feel very lived in, but trying to think of how to put this. What I really couldn't get past, there was some weird mixing of the vampire werewolf anatomy with the spicy scenes, to the point that it kind of made my skin crawl. Like I was just very put off. But I did feel vindicated in not liking this book because Kenzie loves these kind of books and she was like, yeah, no, this was not it. So I do feel like maybe it wasn't just me. There was one aspect of this book that I did enjoy though. There was a mystery element to it, and I thought that the climax of that was pretty interesting. Okay, I'm mostly done being a hater now because those are, I think, the only 3 books that I didn't actually enjoy reading. Everything after this, I would recommend in, you know, varying degrees. But next up we have Tom Lake. I give this 2.5 stars. This book takes place through the framing of a woman who is recounting her acting career and her past love to her children. This is a super well-loved book, but it just didn't hit the mark for me. There's not a lot of substance to it. Like there were parts of it that I thought were good, but it just kind of felt all over the place. And there's an element of that comes with a book like this that is, you know, majority a flashback, but it didn't feel very connected. It was kind of jumpy. It was kind of less like you know, a full story and more just a list of this happened and then this happened and then this happened. I kept kind of waiting for those things to escalate or tie together and they never really did. So it's not bad by any means, just a little boring. The best part of this book though, I did the audiobook for this one. I do a mix of like audiobooks and then reading on my Kindle and a little bit of actually reading a physical book, but the audiobook for Tom Lake is narrated by Meryl Streep and she does a phenomenal job. If you're wanting to read this book, highly recommend the audiobook. It was chef's kiss. Moving on to The Idea of You, I give this 3 stars. Here's the thing, if you go into this book ready to be transported back into the days of like reading One Direction fanfic on Tumblr, you will absolutely be pleased. But if you're expecting some sort of like gripping romance that's gonna have you super invested and will catch you by surprise, you will be disappointed. That said, I liked it for what it was. I thought it was really fun. A solid 3-star book. I enjoyed the experience of reading this. I also was kind of in a reading slump when I picked this one up and it really got me out of it just because it's so easy to read, but it's not a book that's really gonna stick with me after. Next book, very different tone. We have The Tattooist of Auschwitz. I gave this 3 stars. This is historical fiction about a man surviving in a concentration camp during World War II. And I'd say the overarching kind of theme of this book is just people trying to do good and be good in little ways in the worst of circumstances. I've read a lot of historical fiction, especially in this time period, and there were parts of this book that just felt a little off to me, and then when I finished it and I started researching more about the book, that started to make a lot of sense. I later found out there was some controversy with this book. It's classified as historical fiction, but based very heavily on interviews that the author did with a real person and his real experiences. And many of the characters in this book are based on real people, and there were descendants of those people who were not happy with the portrayal. Next we have It Ends With Us. Colleen Hoover, she's loved, she's hated. I wanted to see for myself because I had never read one of her books. I give this 3 stars. It's a romance, kind of, but not really. At first, when I heard this book was a romance and then the story started to play out, I was like really worried that some terrible things were gonna be played off as romance, but they weren't in the end. And I think the meaning of the title that we find out at the end of the book is really good, but overall, Colleen Hoover, I think, just isn't for me. The writing style, the dialogue just didn't get me invested, but it was a quick read, an easy read, and I did enjoy it. So 3 stars. Next up, we have another 3-star book. This is Before the Coffee Gets Cold. I loved the premise of this book. A coffee shop that can transport you back in time to have a conversation with a loved one over a cup of coffee, but you can only stay until the coffee gets cold. Concept, fantastic. Execution wasn't as great. It did drag a little bit. Also, this is a Japanese book, so I was reading a translated version of it, so maybe there are aspects of it that just didn't translate as well. This is a short book. It's more of a novella, but it took me a while to get through because, like I said, there were parts that just kind of dragged. Okay, next we have Wildfire, another 3-star book. This is by Hannah Grace. I read another one of her popular books, Icebreakers, but I ranked that one a little bit higher just because this one didn't deliver in quite the way that that book did. It was a little boring in some ways, but really, if I was gonna describe this book, this is just a horny book. For that, it does deliver. The spicy scenes are good. It's a quick, easy read, a summer romance. There's barely any plot, and the plot that it did have was kind of boring. So I was just kind of like, all right, get back to the spicy scenes. And for what it was, those were pretty good. So 3 stars. Next up on the list, we have One Dark Window. I gave this one 3 stars as well. It's romantasy, but really, I feel like the romance was more of a subplot. It was a pretty slow start, but it did get better. I thought the magic system in this book was really interesting. My main complaint with this book is it's a series, and this is a pet peeve of mine when, because it's a series, the end of a book is super abrupt, especially when it's the first book. When the book ended, it felt like nothing had been wrapped up. It was really abrupt. And I get that like they're setting up the next book, but you gotta give us some sort of like closure or wrap up, and then yeah, like leave the door open for the next book, but it felt like nothing really wrapped up. But I am interested in picking up the second book. The lore of this series did grab me, and I want to find out more about this Shepherd King, but not enough that I picked up the second book immediately. I read this in October, I think. think. So it's kind of one of those things where like, yeah, I'm interested in the next book, but I'm not like dying to pick it up. Another 3-star romantasy book for me, we have A Fate Inked in Blood. This is a Norse mythology fantasy romance, and this was picked for a book club that I'm in. Probably wouldn't have picked it for myself, but I did end up really enjoying it, especially because it starts really strong right off the bat, and I feel like sometimes where fantasy books lose me is like the big like lower exposition dump at the beginning, and this book just kind of jumped right into it. It lost me a little bit in the middle. Some of the twists felt really predictable, but it had a solid romance and it was an enjoyable read. Next we have All the Light We Cannot See. I gave this 3 stars. It is a historical fiction book set during World War II, and we follow kind of the 2 parallel lives of these children growing up, stepping into early adulthood, navigating the world in this, you know, changing landscape. There's a lot of interesting stuff here, but ultimately this wasn't a book that I ever felt like I really got immersed in. I kept waiting for things to click, and it never really came together. It didn't captivate me in the way that I expected, especially with how like critically acclaimed this book is. When it comes to World War II historical fiction, I think there's better out there, but ultimately I did really enjoy this book. Okay, next up we have, I think this is our first nonfiction book on the list. We have The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. It's her autobiography. 3.5 stars for me. It was fascinating to hear her side of things that like were blown up in the media that I've like seen on magazine covers through my whole life, and like hearing about what was actually happening. But I felt like this book could have benefited from maybe a little bit more editing and a little more self-reflection. This book felt like she's still very much processing a lot of it. And so I get why they didn't want to edit out more of it. And I'm glad she's getting her side of the story out there. My heart like really broke with her talking about all of the stuff with her kids, and I'm wishing nothing but the best for Britney. Moving on to another 3.5 star book, we have Ruthless Vows. This was the sequel to Divine Rivals that I read in the 24-hour readathon video. That book I have ranked higher. This one, the plot felt kind of contrived. The ending didn't really do it for me. I had higher hopes for this like big battle that everything was leading up to, but romance is at the heart of the story, and I really like the romance. I was definitely rooting for the 2 characters. It's cute, it's an easy read, but just not quite as good as the first one. Next up, we have another sequel, It Starts With Us. This is Colleen Hoover. It's the sequel to It Ends With Us. I give this one 3.5 stars. I actually liked it significantly more than the first one. There are some mildly spicy scenes. I did root for this romance. Just a little forgettable to me, and I feel like now I've given Colleen Hoover a try, and I'm not too interested in reading more from her. Next we have Book Lovers. I give this 3.5 stars. This is a sweet story. It's simple, it's an easy read, and Emily Henry just writes banter and tension so well. I feel like that is her forte, and I have some other books from her ranked higher on this list. This one just didn't stick with me quite as much, but I really enjoyed it. Oh, literally next on the list is another one of her books, Beach Read. 3.5 stars. This was another easy read romance. I felt invested in the characters, but this was the 3rd book from her that I read, and at this point I realized that a lot of her books have very similar elements, and it felt a little bit rehashed. I think she's so good at what she does, and like I said, like the dialogue, the banter, the tension, it makes the romance feel so much more real, and it's one of those books that a lot of times I would like find myself smiling while I was reading it because it's just so cute, but it being so similar to some of her other books, it made it kind of lose a little bit of the charm for me. Next we have Hang the Moon, 3.5 stars, and honestly, I kind of feel like this book is ranked too high. Like going back through now and giving these rankings in order, I'm like, wait, I don't feel like this book was as good as some of the other ones I just said. But that being said, I did do all of these rankings within like a day or 2 of finishing the book because I wanted it to be fresh. So I feel like there are definitely some books now that I would maybe rank higher or lower as I've had time to like sit with it and see what sticks with me. So I don't know, I feel like I overranked this book a little bit. That being said, this book is a drama about a woman in the Prohibition era. It's really just kind of about her trying to survive and continue her family's legacy as like tragedy after tragedy is unfolding around her. This book definitely has like a good, strong lead, but it kind of felt all over the place. I wanted a little bit more. Also in the 3.5 star range, we have Malibu Rising. This book follows 4 siblings over the course of one night as this wild party is unfolding, as well as flashbacks about how their family came to be, the abandonment from their father. It was a little boring, but it did pick up at the end. This is a Taylor Jenkins Reid book, and I just really enjoy her writing. So even though it's my lowest ranked of her books that I read this year, it was still a very enjoyable read just because her writing is so fun to read. Okay, next we have The Simple Wild, also 3.5 stars, but take this rating with a grain of salt. Honestly, take all of my ratings with a grain of salt, but this book especially because I seem to be very much in the minority of not just absolutely loving this book. It was okay. It's got this slow burn romance, and it's about this woman reconnecting with her father, coming back to Alaska where she was born, gaining this appreciation for the Alaskan wild and the way of life there. I found the main character to be really annoying, and also the love interest to be unlikable and a little bit of a misogynist. This book gets compared a lot to The Great Alone by Kristen Hanna, but honestly, I feel like the only similarity is that they both take place in Alaska. There's not really much of a comparison to me, but we'll get to that book much later in the next video, actually. Oh my gosh, we still have so many books to go. I feel like I'm talking too much about every book, but I don't know, maybe this will be a video that you can like put on in the background while you're doing dishes, listen to while you're driving. Sorry, it's gonna be a long one. I just scrolled through being like, oh, I must almost be done with the first half, but nope. We got a long way to go. Okay, moving up to 3.8 stars, The Winter Garden. Or no, just Winter Garden. This is another historical fiction by Kristen Hanna, and it follows two sisters trying to unravel the story of their mom's past growing up in Russia during World War II. And Kristen Hanna just writes about desperation and war in such detail. It makes you feel so connected. The second half of this book was so strong. Like honestly, 5 stars to the second half. This book is really only so low because the first half was so repetitive, but the payoff in the end, absolutely worth it. Next up, we have a nonfiction book. It's The Second World War. I give this 3.8 stars. This is a nonfiction, expansive history of World War II. And what I really appreciated about this book is it's not just Europe, but how other countries and people all around the world were affected. It was dense and detailed, and one of the longer books that I read this year. It took me a while to get through, but I learned so much that was never even touched on in school. And I think this book really helped educate me and gave me important background that lended really well to the historical fiction that I read this year set in this time period. Next, also at 3.8 stars, we have Billy Summers. This book is about a hitman who wants to be a writer. It's so well written. It's by Stephen King. Very interesting, and the main character is like such an anti-hero. I feel like they did such a good job of like making you root for him even though you know he's bad. But it was a little convoluted. The first half, super strong. It did also really have some like dark and gruesome things that were thrown in later in the book that just didn't feel really necessary to the plot, and on a personal note made it hard to read. So if you're thinking of picking up this book, definitely look up some trigger warnings before you pick it up. Make sure that it's something you're okay with. Make sure you know what you're getting into. We are now in the 4-star tier. I feel like everything from here on out, they're great books. And that's saying something because we're not even at the halfway point, and I feel like everything after this I would absolutely recommend. So we have The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs, nonfiction, if you couldn't tell by the title. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It's written by a paleontologist. I learned a lot. A little dull at times, but overall very interesting. Books like this I love to listen to like a podcast, and now I get to spout out random dinosaur facts at people, so very much enjoyed. Next up we have the only reread on this list, Where the Crawdads Sing. I give this 4 stars. I read this a few years ago and it popped back into my head after I read The Great Alone, which is now my second mention of The Great Alone because I absolutely loved it. But I really wanted to read more stories on that kind of like female self-reliance, especially in the wilderness, and this book popped back into my head, and I feel like I didn't really appreciate it the first time I read it, and just being in that headspace after just finishing The Great Alone, I feel like I enjoyed it so much more. The details that I felt like were kind of boring in my first read about like her solitude and surviving in the marsh. I feel like the second time around, I found really, really interesting because of The Great Alone. We have Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. This is another one that I did as an audiobook and kind of treated like a podcast. And it goes through all these different ways that data bias affects the way that the world is built and really negatively affects women, from like medicine to engineering to city planning to disaster response. It changes the way that you look in the world. It is equal parts fascinating and infuriating, just in the way that like literally everything, even things that you wouldn't think of, are built for men. And how many studies have proved time and time again just how detrimental the effects of that can be. This book is very evidence-based, and the author is citing studies on like pretty much every page, which I would expect based on, you know, the title, but I love quantitative data like this. And that can make it a little dense and repetitive at sometimes, but like that's a give and take with proving the points and showing the data to back it up. And this is definitely a book that will change the way that you look at the world. Also 4 stars. Next we have What It Is Like to Go to War. I read this book to get more background on the Vietnam War after reading one of my favorite historical fiction books of the year that's set during that time. And this book is nonfiction. It explores the author's own experiences, as well as diving into more philosophical questions about what war and destruction and killing does to the human psyche. Very interesting, incredibly vulnerable 4 stars. Okay, next, another 4-star nonfiction, Bad Blood. This is the story of Theranos. It was a tech company started by Elizabeth Holmes that ended up being exposed as like a massive fraud. It goes through all the shady history. I also, before reading this book, I watched the Hulu series, The Dropout, which stars Amanda Seyfried. So while I was reading this whole book, I was like picturing her. But it was really fascinating to hear about like the real story of that. And this book is written by the Wall Street Journal journalist who broke this story. So the author has an interesting perspective in that he's removed enough from it, like he wasn't part of Theranos, so he's removed enough from it to, at least from my perspective, have like a pretty unbiased bird's eye view of everything. But also, he was pretty involved in the case and was a big part of exposing Theranos and had a lot of inside knowledge about everything. I listened to this as an audiobook on a trip up to LA where I was doing so much driving, and it was the perfect thing to pass the time. Even though it's nonfiction, the way it unfolds is really like a mystery. Okay, going back to historical fiction, another 4-star book for me, The Book Thief. This is set during World War II. It follows a young girl in Germany and her foster family. And this book really wrestles with the idea of like how you can stand up against hate and tyranny. And the book is narrated by death itself, which gave a very, very interesting perspective given the setting. Okay, big tonal shift to the next one. This is a Star Wars book, Darth Plagueis, also 4 stars. This book covers the plan that the Sith were formulating up until Episode 1, the movie, with Darth Plagueis and his apprentice, who we all know, who eventually overtakes him. And this book made me want to go rewatch all the prequels so bad, and I did. It gave me a whole new lens. I also listened to the audiobook on this one, and Star Wars audiobooks are so fun. They're amazing with like the sound effects, the music, the voice talent. It's very immersive. Great storytelling, fantastic Star Wars lore, but I do sometimes find myself just getting a little glossy-eyed when it's just like alien name after alien name after alien name. Oh my god, the tones of these books are all over the place. Another tonal shift. We have Icebreakers, a notoriously very spicy book. It's very popular on TikTok. I give this 4 stars. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It is enemies to lovers. It's very surface level. It's predictable, but I'm not reading it for the plot. I'm reading it for the spicy scenes. And on that, it fully delivered. Oh my gosh, did it deliver? And it's a cute romance. I was rooting for the couple. They didn't frustrate me. There are some scenes to return to, some very bookmarkable parts, if you know what I'm saying. Oh my god. I didn't think about the order that I was ranking these books as I did them, because it's just every time I would read a book, I would give it a star rating and then decide where it goes in the lineup. And okay, next we have the biography of Steve Jobs, also 4 stars. Real talk though, he led a fascinating life. This book really sheds a light on just how fascinating and creative and also flawed he was. There's no hero worship. It seems like a very true depiction. And he interviewed Jobs himself before he passed, as well as his family, his friends, his colleagues. Really unique guy. Interesting story. Okay, also nonfiction, but a little bit different. We have a parenting book. This is No Drama Discipline. This is a book, it almost feels strange to include this in the rankings, but I'm ranking every book that I've read this year, so gotta include this one. It really covers how to hold boundaries with your kids while keeping everything centered in love and connection and respect. And that's how I try to approach parenting. So this book was really helpful for me. It's very science-based, but emotionally informed as well, which I love. I thought it had a great balance. Like I said, kind of hard to rank books like this, but I give it 4 stars. As a parent to a toddler, it was very helpful for me. All right, next in the ranking, we have Divine Rivals. This is the first book that I talked about the sequel earlier. It's about 2 journalists in this kind of urban fantasy setting where it's like our world, but magical. Super cute romance. I was absolutely rooting for them. And the vibes were really good. The 2 romantic leads are connected by this magical typewriter, and it was super cute. And there was also like this interesting lore to dive into about like these warring gods, but it did kind of leave on a cliffhanger. And as I said earlier, I don't like that. I want a book to feel complete. And this one, as good as it was, didn't quite wrap up. Okay, that is the halfway point. That is the first part of me ranking every book that I read this year. Come back tomorrow for part 2, or if you're watching this more than a day after I posted it, it's already up. I'll link it in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts if you read any of these books. How do your rankings compare to mine? And again, leave your book recommendations in the comments, and I will see you guys very soon. Bye.